Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Good evening. It's good to see that so many of you have found your way to the IDHEAP this evening, or from our office to down here to the Ola if you work here. It's good to see. I have the enormous pleasure to welcome today to the IDHEAP my colleague Eva Thomann from the University of Konstanz. And Eva and I, we've known each other for quite a long time, I think. We did our PhD together at the University of Bern. You finished a bit earlier than I did, but I think we had a couple of years that we stayed there together. Today, however, Eva is a full professor of public administration at the Department of Politics and Public Administration at the University of Konstanz. Some say that still belongs to Switzerland, others say that belongs to Germany. I think officially it's in Germany, right? But really close to the canton of Thurgau. And previously she held research and visiting positions at the University of Bern, Universities of Mannheim and Heidelberg in Germany, Exeter in the UK, and at the European University Institute in Florence. She has a master's degree in political science from the University of Zurich and the PhD, as I said before, from Bern University at the KPM. Eva today is a political scientist who specializes in public policy and public administration, and she has a bouquet of research interests, I would say. There are really a lot of things that I could mention here. I'm only going to mention a few of them. Policy implementation, Europeanization and European integration, street-level bureaucracy, that will be part of her talk today as well, and many, many others. She serves for various groups in public administration, for instance, the European Group of Public Administration, the Comparative Methods for Systematic Cross-Case Analysis, and the International Research Society for Public Management, the IRSPM. And she is also, and that is very important, the founder and academic convener of the Konstanz Methods Excellence Workshops, or COMEX. I think you have a bit of a marketing window later on that as well, which is highly interesting, especially to our PhD students who are in the room, and I think there are many of them, as far as I can see from here. And Eva is also the co-editor of the journal Regulation and Governance. And today, Eva, you will talk about the topic bringing street-level bureaucrats' behavior and accountability regimes into policy evaluation. That is a still relatively new stream of research, I would say, where influences from even psychology and behavioral sciences come into policy research. Highly interesting field, in my view. And the question you will talk about today is, how does the behavior of those who represent the front lines of government, the street-level bureaucrats, influence the effects of policies in practice? Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you very much for being here, Eva, and I look forward to your talk.
Mm-hmm. Hello, everybody. Bonjour. Thank you so much for having me. What can I say? It's almost Switzerland, Constance, but if I want the apéro, I need to come to Switzerland. We don't have it. Also, can you please let me know, Oliver, the turnout for Adolf Oki, so just for my ego, just because this is really amazing. Thank you for coming. Okay. Thank you for coming. When I prepared this presentation, I remembered that I think the first time I presented here at IDHEAP was in 2014, when I was still a PhD student. And in fact, what I'm presenting today builds up on what I presented there, and it also builds up on what I presented in a PhD course here in 2022. So those of you who have attended one of those lectures, sorry for the overlap, but hopefully you will also see how this research agenda has evolved into something bigger and maybe also more meaningful. Before I start, can we switch the screen? I wanted to follow up on what Oliver said about the comics workshops. So for those of you who who do a PhD or for some other reason are interested in leveling up their research method skills, we are offering a series of workshops from the February 26th to March 1st at the University of Constance. Some of these courses are in presence, so in Constance, but some of them are online. And our early bird deadline ends basically by the end of the month. So there are still spaces available. A 5-day course costs 390 euros, so it's very affordable. And there may be something in there for you. So, for example, we have presence courses on a range of different things. I offer a course on comparative case study design, and we still have spaces if you want to sign up. And then we have a range of online courses. So if you're interested in that, just sign up. So you can Google Constance Methods Excellence Workshops, and you will directly get to our website. All right?
Can I have just one more word
Yes.
while you switch to the other slides? There is a photographer in the room. Is there anyone who doesn't want to be taken photos of? Please raise your hand if that's the case. Doesn't seem to be the case. Thank you.
Full consent. Great. So thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk today about basically a blend of some of my recent work building up on earlier work. On the one hand, a recently published book chapter with Eva Thomann from ETH Zurich about bringing the behavior of street-level bureaucrats into policy evaluation. So basically, what can we learn for policy evaluation when we analyze street-level bureaucrats through a behavioral perspective? And this has been published in a handbook on policy evaluation, edited by Pirmin Bundi, who is in the room, and Frédéric Baron and Steve Jacobs. Great handbook, by the way. And thanks for the impetus for writing this chapter. Thank you. And on the other hand, I'm going to use my work on the accountability regimes framework, which I have been developing in the last 10 years, and which, by the way, also partly builds up on the work by Aurélien Buffat, who is also here in the room, with Peter Huppé, and where we focus on the relationships of street-level bureaucrats and how these result in accountabilities, informal accountability relations, and how these shape what street-level bureaucrats do and how they diverge from formal policies in their practice. And so I'm gonna use that to illustrate the arguments that I make. Okay? And I have too many slides, sorry, so I'm just gonna rush over some of them. Good. So I'm going to talk first just about the general perspective that I'm adopting in this presentation and why I would argue it matters. And then I will talk about 5 propositions that Eva Thomann and I make in the chapter. And so I'm basically going to use this as an opportunity to walk you through different important core concepts of the behavioral street-level bureaucracy literature. And then I'm going to illustrate that with my work on the ARF, which builds on work that I've done in my 3 years in Exeter, where I was a lecturer at the university, and we had to implement what's called the prevent duty. So the prevent duty is a law in the UK that says that university lecturers have to report any student that they deem at the risk of radicalization. They have to report them to the police or to the Home Office. So I was basically not just a lecturer, but also a police officer. And that did interesting things to my relationships with students. And so I'm going to use that as an example. Okay, so I'm probably preaching a bit to the choir here, but why do street-level bureaucrats matter for a perspective on policy evaluation? So street-level bureaucrats are really those bureaucrats that operate at the front line of policy, that interact with citizens and clients in order to deliver public services. And they have a substantial degree of discretion in doing so. And they are often professionals more than bureaucrats. So for example, teachers or welfare officers or police officers. Well, these people are really the human face of bureaucracy, and they're often the most direct experience that people actually make with the state. So they are this interface, and so they really, what they do really matters for how policies are actually put into practice. They can use their discretion to change policies for the good or for the bad, right? But they frequently do so. And so what that also means is that, when we adopt a policy evaluation perspective, we want to understand the effects of policies, right? And so we want to understand how policies are put in practice and then what effects that produces. And what we can learn from the street-level bureaucracy literature is that we cannot understand these processes without understanding what street-level bureaucrats do and why. And we have also seen, so for example, in the recent pandemic, that many street-level bureaucrats have a systemic relevance for keeping up public services during crisis. We've seen that with the health workers, and we see that time and again. So, when we focus on street-level bureaucracy, I really like this work by Kent Weaver. I'm afraid my pointer is not working well. Down here, about the barriers to compliance, where he says, well, there are structural and political barriers to making policies work in practice. And often when we evaluate policies, we focus on those. But there are also cognitive barriers. Sorry for the typo there. So barriers relating to a lack of information or a lack of cognition, understanding of things, people's attitudes and beliefs toward things. There can be peer effects when we have echo chambers, for instance, where different people reinforce each other's views. And all of this influences how street-level bureaucrats and how people comply with policies. And so what that means is that it matters for policy evaluators not just to look at street-level bureaucrats, but also to adopt what I would call a behavioral perspective on them. Because it's about psychology to a very large degree, what happens at the front line of policy implementation. And the structural factors interact with the psychology of it. So when I say I adopt a behavioral perspective, what I'm saying is that we look at the micro-level perspective of what individual bureaucrats do, what their behavior is, what their attitudes are, using insights from psychology. So our units of analysis would be street-level bureaucrats or managers rather than maybe organizations or institutions. We would focus on the behavior and attitudes of these people, and we would integrate insights from psychology and behavioral science. So we would really try and understand what motivates people and what shapes their behavior at the micro level. Note that this definition says nothing about methodology. There are a lot of discussions which I think are very important about the use, for example, of experiments to study these things. And a lot of people automatically associate behavioral public administration with the use of experiments. But most scholars of behavioral public administration that I know don't say that. It is true that a lot of behavioral scholarship uses experiments, but it's not part of the definition. And you can study the psychology of policy implementation without using experiments. And I think this is important to stress here, that I'm not talking about using experiments. And it's not least because this is also a discussion in the policy evaluation literature. So there are people who basically preach that, randomized control trials and things like that, so quasi-experimental or experimental designs are the best way to evaluate public policies. I'm not saying that as well, okay? So, in the chapter with Eva, we draw 5 lessons from the behavioral literature. The first one is quite basic. We argue that policy outputs, so that the administrative products of policy implementation, are crucially shaped by the behavior of street-level bureaucrats, and street-level bureaucrats are boundedly rational. Now, what does that mean? Bounded rationality means that people don't actually always act rationally. So they don't necessarily pursue the optimal course of action had they known all the different options and did they have the time and resources they need to assess all the different alternatives and make the best possible decision. That's actually not how most of human behavior works. Instead, rationality is limited, for example, because problems are complex, so they're not very tractable, because they have cognitive limitations. Maybe they lack an understanding, or they are lazy, or we all have all sorts of cognitive limitations, don't we? I mean, I include myself here, and because they often don't have the time to make the best possible decision. And this, for example, is of course exacerbated by, let's say, crisis situations, or by new public management where there is pressure to increase efficiency, and so on. So what it means is that street-level bureaucrats seek a satisfactory solution rather than necessarily an optimal one. So that means we need to understand the psychology behind this, right? So principal agent theory, assuming rational choice, is not going to get us very far, right? So just very briefly, what that would mean, this perspective, it would really mean we would focus, I'm just assuming you know this bathtub, the Coleman's bathtub. We would really focus on this micro level here and look at how conditions of individual action, like the context in which street-level bureaucrats work or their social relationships, affect what they do in the end, like, for example, how they allocate resources or why they sanction some clients and not others, or why they diverge from the formal policy and do something slightly different, that this would be influenced by bounded rationality, so how they process information, how they cope with pressures, how they interact with others, the clients, their peers, their principals, and the accountability relations that they have. So that's, I would say, a very exciting research agenda. So an important concept here is the concept of street-level divergence, crucially coined by Anat Goffen. What does that mean? And so we consciously here don't use the word compliance, because divergence just means that the actions of street-level bureaucrats may differ from the formal policy implementations. That may be non-compliant, but it may also be compliant. It just means that street-level bureaucrats adapt rules that are often ambiguous to the practical situation. This is usually a choice. So it can be a rational choice, for example, because they don't have enough time to do things the way they would like to do it. It can be an ethical choice, so they might think that it is not right. So Anat Goffen, for example, brings this example of nurses in Israel who decide to provide vaccinations for free for poor families, even though the law had actually changed and they were not really allowed to give them for free anymore because they thought it was important to do that. And they did that collectively. And that, by the way, led to a policy change in the end. So the policy was changed again because the nurses did not comply with it. But we also know things like, to think about the Black Lives Matter movement, where there is a systematic racial discrimination which actually kills people. So divergence can also be something very bad, right? So we need to understand better why it happens. It's inevitable because of the ambiguity inherent in rules that are being implemented, because of time constraints, because of bounded rationality. So we should study it. Goffen makes this nice distinction between divergence that can be motivated in a self-serving matter, so just because, for example, somebody wants to make things more comfortable for themselves in their daily practice, but it can also be other-serving. So the example of the nurses is an other-serving motivation, right? They don't do it for themselves, they do it for the poor people. And it can be an individual practice, so somebody just does things a bit differently for themselves, or it can really be a collective effort. And it can happen transparently or in the hidden. So it can be an open action or a hidden action. And so why is this important for policy evaluators? Well, at the most basic level, what this tells us is that the human factor really matters for how policies are implemented. On the one hand, policy evaluators can study the context in which street-level bureaucrats work. So, for example, the resources that they have, but also the professional self-image that they have. The design of the policy that they implement, to understand how they react to the policies and why they would take certain choices. So, for example, if you have a long-standing tradition among teachers for how they have learned as professionals how languages are best taught, and then suddenly you have a reform, from their perspective, imposed from politicians that tells them to completely change the methodology behind their language teaching, then you should expect resistance from them. And I'm going to tell you later why that is. It's also because they have their own heuristics and biases that they apply. And one of them is the status quo bias, so people prefer to keep doing things the way they've always done them. But it can also be because of their professional values and the professional knowledge, where they say, well, we actually know much better than those politicians how to teach languages. And these things can, to a degree, be anticipated or understood if you actually talk to street-level bureaucrats. And street-level divergence should not just be seen as something that needs to be reduced or controlled, but it can also be a resource to build on, because street-level bureaucrats usually have quite a good idea of how goals of a policy are best achieved. And we can study how the organizational context helps them or constrains them in doing so. And we can look at how this influences how they choose to diverge from the policy. A second lesson zooms in on the attitudes of street-level bureaucrats, which are a key determinant of practical policy outputs. So it's a key, their attitudes toward a policy, how they think of a policy determines how they implement it and how willing they are to implement the policy. There is a lot of work on this by Lars Thommers and his various co-authors on this concept of policy alienation, for instance, which denotes a psychological disconnection from the policy program that the frontline workers should implement. For example, they can think that the policy is meaningless, so that it does not achieve, for example, the goals that it should achieve, it's not well suited to do that, or that it is not actually helping the clients very much. But it can also relate to a feeling of powerlessness, so that they feel, that frontline workers feel that they have no influence on the decisions, on the one hand, strategic decisions on how the policy looks like, so basically the design of the policy, but also how it is later being implemented at the organizational level and operationally. And there is research by myself, but also others, that shows that feeling powerful, so having this possibility to actually contribute to the policy and its implementation, is a very important motivating factor for street-level bureaucrats. So the more powerful they are, because it gives them this feeling of self-efficacy. Self-efficacy means that you feel that you have the capability to do things, which they need to be motivated. And this motivation, in turn, contributes to their actual compliance. Another aspect that has been studied quite well is the role of roles. So the different roles that street-level bureaucrats have, like, for example, they are professionals. So, for example, a teacher is a teacher, so they have been trained as teachers, right? But they are also policy implementers, so they have to implement policy, government policy. But then they are also mentors, so they also have a relationship with students, which can be very meaningful to them. And then they are also members of organizations which have their own goals and which, for example, have to prevent deficits from occurring. And so in these different roles, they can have conflicts between those roles. And this is actually, on the one hand, really, again, so these role conflicts, it has been shown that more role conflicts are associated with a lower willingness to implement policies from street-level bureaucrats. And it has also been the basis for my own work on the accountability regimes framework, where I take this even a bit further. Right. So implications for policy evaluations. On the one hand, policy evaluators could try and take the whole cycle, the policy cycle into account, and also not just look at how street-level bureaucrats implement policies, but also the degree to which they are involved in deciding on policies, designing policies, taking strategic decisions. Because this will help explain why and how they implement policies. And if they find that street-level bureaucrats resist the policy, then it is worth diving into the reasons for that. Is it because the policy is unrealistic, it does not give them enough resources? Or is it because the policy contradicts other policies that they also have to implement? We can learn a lot from street-level bureaucrats about this, right? So policy coherence, external coherence, internal coherence, the street-level bureaucrats can tell us about it. And so from this, we can derive recommendations for policy design, and we can look at whether the use of, for example, management strategies, change strategies, can actually make sense in order to change street-level bureaucrats' attitudes toward the policy. And we can analyze how the consistency of the policy, the internal and external consistency of the policy, relates to the meaningfulness of this policy for the street-level bureaucrats. And by increasing consistency, we can also tackle this problem of policy alienation. Am I making sense? So if you have any questions or you don't understand something, don't hesitate to raise your hands, right? Okay. So the third lesson is that to understand policy outputs and outcomes, we need to understand how street-level bureaucrats cope with their work contexts and with administrative burdens as well. And in this respect, I think it's very useful to use this concept of the public service gap, coined by Aurélien Buffat and Peter Hüppe. A very well-cited article, by the way, which is really worth reading, which denotes an inherent discrepancy between what is expected from street-level bureaucrats and what is given to them to achieve that. So a gap between demands and resources. And this gap can take on different forms. Also, understanding the role of time. So resources may increase or decrease or stay the same, and the demands may increase, decrease, or stay the same. The areas that are shaped gray here are basically the areas where street-level bureaucrats are asked to basically do more or the same, but with less resources. And these are the situations when they need to find a way to cope with that. So they need to find a way to sort of do the magic of still delivering the policies, right? And we can analyze this public service gap when we evaluate the policies. And I think it should be a routine part of any policy evaluation, actually. So what does coping mean? Coping, this is really a term from the psychology literature, which applies really well to the street-level bureaucracy literature as well. It means that street-level bureaucrats apply behavioral efforts to master, tolerate, or reduce the demands and conflicts that they face in their work on an everyday basis, which may be external, they may come from outside, or they may come from the inside. We can distinguish different types of coping. What I find really interesting is this distinction by, I think it's Nielsen, no, it's Van Loon and Jacobson, that the coping can just be passive or client-oriented, so just aimed at tolerating the pressures by addressing the symptoms, right? But it can also be active and system-oriented, so street-level bureaucrats can actually try to address the causes of the problem. And especially when we understand that also the latter is possible, then we can understand how individual reactions toward work circumstances in the end have the potential, in the aggregate, to systematically alter the outcomes for the clients and for the organization. Because if every street-level bureaucrat copes, and if we can somewhat predict how they cope, then that would, in total, help us understand directions of divergence, for instance, right? Okay, so the literature distinguishes different types of coping, which it can happen during the interaction with the clients, but it can also happen outside this interaction, and it can consist of behavior or just be at the cognitive level. Here we have a few examples. Those of you who teach, you're also street-level bureaucrats as university educators. You may recognize yourself somewhere here, right? There is quite little literature so far really looking at coping as an independent variable for dependent variable street-level bureaucrats' behavior. So this is also, if you're still looking for a topic for your PhD thesis, it's a very nice topic to work on. And I think what is useful, in the end, I think, now I'm diverging a bit from my slides, I think the big challenge for the behavioral literature is making the step from this micro level of what do individuals do to really understand the implications for social outcomes and policy outcomes in the end. And one distinction that I find useful in this regard is this distinction of coping that leads street-level bureaucrats to move toward clients, so try solve the tension that they have by helping clients, for example, through the use of personal resources, moving away from clients. So, for example, we may ration our time and give every student only 10 minutes in our office hour because we don't have time to attend to all of them more in depth. And moving against clients. So things like discrimination or being overly strict in the classroom. And so if we understand these directions in which street-level bureaucrats move toward or away from client or even against clients, then we can really understand how the street level affects policy outcomes in the end, right? For policy evaluators, again, so I think they should really model this public service gap to understand what street-level bureaucrats cope with. But demand-resource imbalance, this is just one source of coping. There can be ethical issues or software issues, digitalization processes, lots of things that street-level bureaucrats have to cope with. If we find that the causes are structural, then policy evaluators can document that and make recommendations, right, to address that. It could also be that it's the result of unrealistic performance targets. And again, so this is something policy evaluators can document and then make recommendations about. So basically, to understand coping, we should look at the design of the program, we should look at the public service gap, and again, we should talk to the street-level bureaucrats, probably. A fourth lesson. relates specifically to the phase of enforcing public policy. So street-level bureaucrats, many street-level bureaucrats are inspectors, for instance, food safety inspectors or stuff like that, or police officers. So they don't just provide services, but they control people, they sanction people. So that's a slightly different relationship, right? And the literature here, again, tells us that inspectors, for instance, even though they have to enforce rules, they still have discretion in how they control the rules and when they decide to sanction someone and when not. So on the one hand, the rules give them some discretion, so that's what we call discretion as granted. But then they also may use the discretion or may not use it. So that's the discretion as used. And they do so either individually, each for themselves, or the literature also documents collective uses of discretion. So for example, you have inspector teams where they have these regular sessions where they sit down together, they exchange opinions, and so they develop kind of a collective understanding of in what ways is it appropriate to be lenient or not lenient. And there's a literature that documents, this is a descriptive literature, but a very interesting one on these enforcement styles. So how inspectors, for instance, may be more or less formal, so they may just really stick to the rules, or also kind of be a bit more flexible there. How strict they are, coercion. The emphasis that they lie on also educating their inspectees, so try and use the inspections as an opportunity to talk to them about the purpose of the rules and why it makes sense, for example, to improve the conditions for the livestock and how it would also help them to be more productive and things like that, right? The degree to which they prioritize some rules over others when doing the inspections, and the degree to which they are ready to accommodate, to be sort of negotiate a little bit with the inspectees and find a compromise with them and things like that. And these things will influence how safe our food is, for instance, in the end. It will influence what behaviors in the end are sanctions and what behaviors are not sanctioned. And it will greatly influence the compliance behaviors of the clients, so for example, of the livestock farmers. So what are the implications for policy evaluation? So on the one hand, trying to understand what the relationship is between this discretion as granted and then the discretion as used. Understand that there is something like enforcement styles and that it might be part of a policy evaluation to assess enforcement styles. And also understand that discretion can, again, so it can be a resource to build on. It can be the site of creative experimentation. It's called creative discretion, where street-level bureaucrats, through collective discretion, so they exchange with each other, they get to new understandings of what the problem definition is, they collectively explore alternative solutions and implement them in practice, and this can actually lead, for example, to an establishment of good practices at the street level, to learning, and even to structural change. So, the final lesson, how am I going time-wise?
Still have 30 minutes if you want.
Whoa, okay. Good. Now, so we've talked a bit about the sunny side, but there is also a not so sunny side, and here we come to this insight from the literature that street-level bureaucrats, they, again, as said, these ficers, they often decide based on heuristics and biases which shape how they react to policies on the one hand, but also to their encounters with the clients, so the population. And this has broader societal implications. Just to a few definitions, heuristics as such they are just something that's inherent in human behavior. A heuristic is basically a decision shortcut, which is used intuitively to simplify and assist decision making. And we all do that, right? So, for example, as we gain experience with our job, we understand different situations, we can classify them, and we can say, oh, I've seen this before, I know that this works best, right? And this is a necessary part of human behavior and a necessary part of street-level bureaucracy. So I'm not saying that heuristics are something bad, just to clarify this. They are not. They are often very useful because they make policy implementation more efficient. They reduce complexity. But this literature also helps us understand how heuristics can, they don't have to, but they can lead to systematic biases in decision making. And we know too little about the conditions under which this is the case. So the use of heuristics can lead to systematic or cognitive bias when they lead to systematic deviations from the optimal or rational course of action, which optimal or rational is often defined by notions of equality or by, what policies say should be done, right? In the judgments and decision-making process of frontline workers. So this can mean that decisions don't conform to normative standards of how things should be done, especially if they had taken into account all the relevant information. So for example, if a street-level bureaucrat, if a welfare worker has a client and it's a complex case, which the difficult cases tend to be the complex cases, and so they might rely on this availability bias. So they might say, oh, I've seen this kind of stuff before, so this is hopeless, right? And so that basically saves them the time to read the full thing and maybe really try and find the solution that is best for this client. And if this is done systematically, then this can disadvantage the complex clients, right? And it's important to understand these are usually not conscious decisions, they are subconscious decisions. And we all make them, by the way. So I'm going to rush through this a little bit. It's an article that you can, if you're interested in this, read the article by myself and Alice Moseley. It's just a list of some very frequent biases, heuristics and biases. I might pick a few. So, for example, this representativeness heuristic means that frontline workers would classify clients. So they would put them into boxes and say, oh, this client represents stereotype 1, stereotype 2, and then take that as a basis for their decision. I've mentioned the availability heuristic earlier, so they might use the similarity of a case with a recent experience to say, oh, okay, that's this specific box, and I can proceed accordingly. Street-level bureaucrats may act based on affinity, so they may have more sympathy for some clients than for others. And they respond differently to clients who evoke emotions in them, like empathy, but also it could also be the opposite. And so this is, for example, relevant for, let's say, if a client is a neurodivergent person, they might not be very good at these social interactions, and that can create a disadvantage. So this is just an example just to show what it means in real life, right? Confirmation bias. Sometimes there are things people want to believe, and there are things that they don't want to believe. And as researchers, of course, we are immune to confirmation bias, but street-level bureaucrats aren't always immune to that. Anchoring bias, I think this is also interesting. I realized that sometimes I'm a bit prone to this when it comes to dealing with students. I often have a first impression of students, and then I sort of just think, oh, this is a good student or this is not such a good student. So sometimes I have to force myself to give them like a second and third chance. I think these last two biases are also interesting, again, for policy evaluators, because, so for example, the sunk cost heuristic means that when people have already invested a lot in something, they are very reluctant to stop investing in it. So, for example, you may have had, a new program, a new software, let's say, and it's been used for 5 years, and the evidence shows it's not effective, it doesn't work. But because people have already, they have bought it, they have installed it, they have done the training, so they will be very reluctant to switch to a new software, even if they know that it's not actually working well. And that can, of course, affect the capability to implement reforms in a public organization. And the same thing with the status quo bias. I've mentioned it earlier, so people tend to have a preference for continuing to do things the way they've always done it, because, you already have all the shortcuts. It's convenient. And we know that because we live in a direct democracy, right? And so we know that voters are conservative voters because of the status quo bias. And this also affects street-level bureaucrats. And some of these biases, you may have noticed, so a lot of these biases relate to characteristics of clients, who they are, and what their capacity is of shaping the relationship they have with street-level bureaucrats. And that can pose problems for equity. And this is, at the moment, quite a flourishing research agenda, with really trying and understand possible discriminatory behaviors of street-level bureaucrats. And this has a broader relevance because while Weber has posited that the public administration is, neutral and technical and does not discriminate, the insight now is, of course, on the one hand, there is no neutral bureaucracy. It's because the bureaucracy always represents someone. They have a mandate which already binds them to representing decisions that are usually taken by privileged people in decision-making positions. So there is no neutral bureaucracy. And actually there's also literature, this is more a US literature, that says that the social equity as a value is actually one of the core mandates and principles of the public administration. So it's debatable whether that is the case, but as a matter of fact, most constitutions, I'm citing here the German constitution because I usually hold this presentation in Germany, but the Swiss constitution too has a prohibition of discrimination according to characteristics like gender, religion, disability, and all that. So equal treatment of people from different backgrounds by the state, this is an important principle of public service delivery. Now, when we say bureaucratic discrimination, then we don't refer to rules that are discriminatory. Of course, policies can be discriminatory. They can be unjust. But bureaucratic discrimination means what street-level bureaucrats do afterwards when they implement these decisions. So it's the systematically biased behavior of street-level bureaucrats, which may inappropriately harm, disadvantage, or also unfairly advantage a group of clients based on their identifiable characteristics. Why is this a problem? And I'm putting this here because most of us sitting in this room come from a privileged position, and we have probably not had a lot of problems with that. Why is it a problem? Because it systematically facilitates access to public service for some and creates significant barriers for others. And that has far-reaching consequences for society and democracy because it deepens social inequalities at the stage of service delivery. It creates wounds in the people who have these experiences, psychological ones. I mean, Black Lives Matter it's an extreme example, but it can also actually kill people, right? And that's the reality. And importantly, research shows that these experiences really later shape the attitudes of people toward the state, their trust, how they think they themselves deserve, for example, being protected by the police, whether they would seek help when they need it and get those services that they are actually entitled to. And it shapes other behaviors like democratic participation, compliance, and so on. So it is really something that also policy evaluators should care, because again, it really affects what effects policies have in the broader system. And this is just, I've just smuggled in this slide because I'm working on a systematic review where we look at, we review the empirical literature on the effect of different interventions to reduce bureaucratic discrimination. And so just to say that policy evaluators could learn from that, so they could try, it's easy to assume, if we do this, then we're going to tackle this problem. And the literature on bureaucratic discrimination is ripe with these conclusions. So people make a study, the focus is usually on, is discrimination really happening? And how can we design an experiment that really enables us to make the causal inference that it happens? But then they make little, empirical efforts to also understand what can be done to tackle this problem. And I think policy evaluators could focus on that. Just a suggestion. And what our review here suggests, which unfortunately is still not published, is that three things really work quite well. One of them is outreach and engagement. So if the street-level bureaucrats actively seek out to disadvantaged clients, for example, they translate their documents into different languages, or social workers go on the streets with their cars and try and talk to, homeless people. Things like that really helps to improve outcomes for clients. Training, actually, so it's the evidence on anti-bias training is very mixed. It can influence attitudes in the short term. It's unclear whether it also influences the behavior of people and how long-term these effects are. And what also, there is quite good evidence that diversifying the bureaucratic workforce reduces bureaucratic discrimination. So that's what's called passive representation. It's quite unclear how exactly that happens. I'm not going to delve into this passive active representation literature now, but so just to say, so there's really research here to be done, and for example, most of the literature on representative bureaucracy does not have outcomes like bureaucratic discrimination as a dependent variable. So they don't actually look at whether in the aggregate people turn out to be less discriminated. Again, maybe an interesting topic for your PhD thesis. So, I have made a range of arguments. How much time do I have left? Sorry.
That'll be like 10, 15.
Okay. I have made a range of arguments why policy evaluators might be interested in considering the behavior of public administration and of street-level bureaucrats and the psychology behind it. And I want to illustrate some of these points by means of an example where we're using different insights from this behavioral literature to explain the divergence of street-level bureaucrats. And for this, we're using the accountability regimes framework, which is one way to look at public accountability. If you want to know other ways, check out the amazing Cambridge Element by Yannis Papadopoulos, where we understand public accountability, so the answerability of public servants to different audiences through their social relations. And so this framework is based on what I've mentioned earlier, on these different role identities that street-level bureaucrats have. So accountability here is understood as the social relationships in which street-level bureaucrats feel an obligation to explain and justify their conduct to some significant other. Well, significant other here is not meant in the sense of a love interest, which is the correct English use. So this builds on the work by IDHEAP and Hill, 2007, on public accountability. And I have later developed this work first with Peter IDHEAP himself in governance, and then later with my other co-authors. So what that means is that accountability is not just a formal relationship. So for example, street-level bureaucrats, they have formal accountabilities toward the state, so we can sue them if they break the law. That their managers control their performance and so on. So these are formal mechanisms, but they also have informal accountability mechanisms which may be just as strong. So consider yourself as a university lecturer. Of course, there are rules that you have to implement, but some of us also care about the students, right? We want to help them, we want to teach them. We take great satisfaction from seeing them grow. Not all of us, right? I mean, sometimes, and it depends, I know. But just saying, and we also have relationships with our peers, so we also want to, it may also matter to some of us that our colleague thinks that we are good teachers, stuff like that. So there are also informal, these are not formal accountabilities, but informally, some people care about that, and the accountability regimes framework accounts for that, whether we care about it or not, as street-level bureaucrats. And then that may actually shape our behavior. So actors ask just explanations and justifications from each other for the behavior. That's accountability. And then we have demands on street-level bureaucrats, so the so-called action prescriptions. And these demands stem from their different roles. So in my role as a professional, as a university lecturer, there are expectations on me. But also in my role as a mentor for students, there are expectations on me. In my role as a policy implementer, there are expectations on me. These are called action prescriptions, and at the level of within a single street-level bureaucrats, the different accountability pressures or the different action prescriptions add up to pressure, accountability pressure. The accountability pressure is kind of the entirety of the different expectations. And we can measure those things. In the 2018 article, we looked at street-level bureaucrats who are not formally employed by the state, but they still implement public policy. So we looked at a hybrid implementation regime. And more policies are delivered in a hybrid way. So they're delivered by the state together with societal actors. So what we said is you need to understand their role as, so the state is an accountability regime where street-level bureaucrats have to implement rules, so that's rule pressure, like caseloads, policy goals, performance targets. But then they are also professionals, so there is vocational pressure on them, like good practices, medicals, so health workers, they swear an oath, the Hippocratic Oath. So these are professional rules, not legal rules. And from society, so for example, from the students, there are expectations. They may also come from the media, for instance. And then in those hybrid arrangements, we also have pressures from the market. So private providers often also have to make sure that they survive economically, that they are efficient, that they generate profit, that they satisfy their customers. So what that means is that, especially in hybrid settings, the street-level bureaucrats are confronted with a multiplicity of different expectations and demands. They have to juggle those, right? But then we need to understand that on the one hand, they may refer to these different pressures to different degrees. So some street level bureaucrats may not care at all whether they can help the students. They don't really care about the students. Others do. Some street level bureaucrats may really not like the fact that they should also satisfy customers or generate profit. Others may think, well, that's really important, right? So that's basically reference. Reference refers to the importance that street level bureaucrats attach to the different accountability pressures. And now, if you have several of those pressures, they may actually clash with each other. So, for example, implementing all the rules may not be compatible with this pressure to be efficient. So you may have a dilemma between rule pressure and market pressure or incentive pressure. And these are the accountability dilemmas. So when the pressures from two different accountability regimes are clash with each other or are even incompatible with each other. Am I making sense so far? Okay. And so these are the dilemmas. And these are just the definitions from what I just said. Well, what we now argue is that to understand divergence, we need to understand what are the different multiple accountability pressures on street level bureaucrats. How strongly do they refer to these different accountabilities? And so, on the one hand, to the rule pressures, so is it important for them to comply with the rules? And then on the other hand, to these other pressures. And the more they attach reference, so they attach importance to accountability pressures that are different from the rule pressure, the higher is actually the probability that there may be dilemmas. So there may be clashes between rule pressure and other accountability pressures. And accountability, the prevalence of accountability pressures increases the likelihood that street level bureaucrats will diverge from formal policies. Why is that? Because if they face conflicting expectations, they have to choose, they have to take sides. Am I the policy implementer or am I the teacher? Right? And so we know from the behavioral literature that individuals, they care about their reputation, so they want to satisfy, they want to please those audiences that they deem important, right? And this may not be the policymaker, this may not be the state. It might be their colleagues, or it might be the clients. And so they basically have to choose their identity, they have to choose their role, right? And the role that they choose will determine whether or not they diverge from the policy. Does it make sense? Okay. So that sounds all very nice, but does it have any empirical explanatory value? I have to speed up. So what I'm looking here at is the problem of terrorism, which is a bit less salient here in Switzerland than it was in the UK, or is in the UK. And so when I worked in the UK, there is it was shortly after this prevent duty was introduced. And what that means, as I said, is that as a lecturer, I'm not just a teacher for the students, but I also have to police them, right? And if I see students that I deem at risk of radicalization, I should report them to the Home Office, which is a significant step because it means that their data is recorded somewhere and I have no idea what the Home Office does with it, but I also have little reason to trust them about that. Sorry to say it. But this policy is characterized by high discretion because nobody can really control whether I really do that in my daily relations with the students. It's a totally individual assessment when I would say, oh, this student's it's probably at risk of radicalization. High discretion, very high ambiguity. The Home Office has guidance for that. So they have these scenarios that you can go through. But even these scenarios, if you watch them, so there's this training that you have to take, and it's so unclear. So, for example, it says basically if someone I may remember it not entirely correctly. So, but if someone frequently attends a mosque, then that could be a sign of radicalization, right? So, is it also a sign of radicalization to frequently attend a church? You know, so it is also a very politically contested policy because of that, because a lot of people think it is discriminatory. But of course, from the perspective, and so here again, why is it important for policy evaluators? I'm looking to Pierre every time I say policy evaluators, because from the policymaker perspective, it was a great idea. Well, who is in a better position to detect individuals at risk of radicalization than the lecturers? The lecturers interact with them, right? They're closest to them. So why don't we let them help us solve this problem? It's a great idea from a policymaker perspective, but from a policy implementation perspective, it raises a couple of questions. So, and what we argue here is that in addition to those accountability regimes that I've already mentioned, so we have the state, we have society, we have the profession, we have the market. We need to add this political, ideological accountability regime. So we need to understand that street-level bureaucrats are also citizens of a democratic system. So they are political animals, and as such too, they face expectations, external or internal, about what it means to be a good citizen, what it means to be a member of a democracy, and how they should behave in a democracy, also as bureaucrats and in their role as bureaucrats, right? And again, so it could be that they see the implementation of a policy as being in conflict with this role that they have as a citizen. And it goes beyond just their individual political preferences. Because again, we can ask them, what are your preferences? Do you think this is a good policy? But they might separate that from their job, right? So they might say, well, no, I don't disagree with it, but as a university teacher, it is my duty to serve the public, and if this is the official policy, I will implement it. So we need to understand how strongly do they refer to this pressure, and then if they refer strongly to it, does it clash? Do they perceive it as clashing with their role as a policy implementers? Am I making sense? So there's yet another dimension. And so we measured all that. I think I'm gonna skip this slide just because for time reasons. So we can derive a number of general propositions from the accountability regimes framework, and I still have to write that paper, so I will present about that the next time I come to IDHEAP. Okay. So today let's look at the evidence. We did a survey of the social science humanities lecturers. So we web scraped their email addresses, basically a full sample, and 830 of them responded, even though it was the pandemic. So it's a bit of a lousy response rate, but the truth is that it was at the outbreak of the corona, and I think we can be quite proud of it, really. And we also asked them if they would agree to do a qualitative, confidential follow-up interview, and 35 of them also did that. So we asked that only those who indicated that they had made personal experiences where they were in a position of having to judge whether they should apply the prevent duty or not. And part of this survey was a small survey experiment, which we still need to write a paper about the actual experiment. But so basically, we exposed them to a scenario that was taken from the Home Office training materials. So an example that, according to the Home Office, is clearly a case that they would have to report, right? And then we asked them, so we varied different things like the type of threat, Islamist threat, or I don't remember what the others were. I think right-wing and left-wing, and I don't remember all of it because it's not part of the results here. But and then we asked them whether they would be willing to implement the prevent duty in this case, whether they would report the student in this case, and we also asked them what else would they do. So we asked them about their divergence behaviors. So, for example, would they choose to just speak to the students privately, or would they seek advice from their colleagues? Would they formally refer the student, or what else would they do? Or would they just do nothing? And what we find here, so first of all, we find, this is a bit too small, I realize, the darker the bars, the stronger the dilemma is. And so we find that the street-level bureaucrats perceive this policy, this prevent duty, to be at odds with their role as teachers, so a rule professional dilemma, that they find it very difficult to be there for students while implementing this policy, so that's the rule societal dilemma, and that they also, many of them have a rule political dilemma, so they perceive the policy to be at odds with their role as a citizen of the democracy, as a political animal. Not all of them, but considerable shares. So there's a bit of also polarization, basically, among the lectures. And what we see here, so this is the outcomes. So are they willing to implement the policy here? Implementation willingness, likelihood to report, and what else would they do, right? So we can see that there are very low levels of willingness to implement the policy, slightly higher levels of actually implementing the policy, so the likelihood that they would report the student, but still, about 50% of them would actually not comply with the policy. So they would not do it. And if you can see what they would do instead, so most of them would seek informal advice from their colleagues or chat with the student. So they would prefer that over reporting the student. And so then, of course, the question is, what explains that? And what we find is that, on the one hand, indeed, if the street-level bureaucrats refer more strongly to non-rule pressure, so to professional, societal, and political pressure, then they're more likely to experience an accountability dilemma for this policy. And the stronger their accountability dilemmas are, the less likely they are to actually report the policy, so the students. So these accountability dilemmas are a strong predictor of divergence. Another strong predictor is the training that they've received. So the more training they've received on the prevent duty, the more likely they are to report the student, which makes sense because according to the training materials, they should report the student. And so training helps, but a lot of them indicate that they have not actually been trained in the prevent duty. And I mean, I don't know how this is here, but when you work at the UK university, you basically get, every day you get an email about another thing that you're also supposed to do. So it's like you just, actually, I think after 3 years being there, I was also supposed to clean my own office. I'm not kidding you, and empty my trash bin in my office because the university was, changing. And so this was just like another thing that was put on them, but they didn't. Many of them didn't receive proper training. So that's of course also a significant factor. So it's not just about the accountability dilemmas, right? And by the way, less training also makes it more likely that they have a dilemma. That they feel that they have a dilemma even though they don't really know the policy, right? So what can we learn from that? I would argue the accountability regime's framework is useful to explain policy divergence. It helps us model the different informal accountability pressures on street-level bureaucrats, how they coexist and how they translate through social roles and relationships into divergence. And as such, it is actually a theory, so it really helps us explain things And especially the street level bureaucracy is actually very scarce of theories. So in this literature, there's a lot of concepts and few theories, and I would argue that the ARF is a step toward that. What can policy evaluators or policy designers learn from this, Pirmin? It is actually possible to model this and just to analyze it. So if we know the different roles that street level bureaucrats have, we can look at what are probably the different pressures that they face. And we can even ask them, right? And it's relatively easy to see. So I would argue in the case of the prevent duty, if they had done that, they would have seen that it creates dilemmas. It's not hard to see, right? And what it also shows us is that street-level bureaucrats correct for policies that they think are not good policies. So they, if these policies stand at odds with their duties as political citizens or their ideological beliefs or their role as professionals and so on, they do that. We can show that they do. And I think that's something that's important to know for policy evaluators. And I also think it has implications that we need to think about. So that's my last slide. What does that mean? So if non-elected public officials or bureaucrats do that, and if they correct for policies based on their understandings of their different roles, then what are the implications for democracy? What are the mechanisms of accountability that apply? So I think here again we can make this step to the bigger picture, from the individual to the bigger, right? And there's a lot of work to be done here. For policy, I think I've already said that. So for policy evaluators, check the different accountabilities and also consider that divergence becomes quite likely even if formal accountability arrangements are make sense and are actually really strict. But if the policy really runs against the professional image that the street level bureaucrats have of themselves, or if it clashes with the market incentives that they have, we've shown that for the Swiss food safety inspectors, for instance, the veterinarians, then we can show that divergence really becomes a likely outcome. And so I need a good final sentence now. I hope I have shown that and how a behavioral perspective can really contribute to understanding how street level bureaucrats matter for evaluating policies in the sense of understanding the effects of public policies in practice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eva, for this highly interesting presentation. I think at universities we typically see three types of presentations. The first type is highly relevant to research. The second type is highly relevant to practice, and the third type is not relevant to neither of those. And I think your presentation really stands out because it's really super relevant in terms of theory and research, both in public policy and in public management, public administration, if you will. And it also has many implications for practice as well. It raises many questions that are geared towards practitioners as well. I have some, but first of all, we'll see if there's anyone in the room who has questions for Eva. Please raise your hand. The microphone will be delivered to you.
Yes, does it work? I think so, yeah. So thanks a lot, Eva, for your presentation, also wrapping up your chapter, which is a very nice contribution to the evaluation literature. but also giving insights or introduction to this accountability regime frameworks, which I really like. I have a question and maybe a comment. So first, the question is I have recently reread an article by Carol Weiss, written in the 90s. And I was thinking about your chapter with Eva, where she was analyzing why evaluations are not used so often. And one of the arguments she was doing in this article was that actually managers or public servants, they feel not powerful enough to implementations. They say, well, I'm just a public servant. This is beyond my my duty as a manager of the program or as a public servant. And I was also thinking about now the argument that you made with street level bureaucrats, that they feel, well, if they feel especially powerful, then they're more likely to implement. So do you have any reflections regarding, well, do you know how powerful they feel in the end, the street level bureaucrats? And do you have any, I don't know, experience, knowledge, data on that? And the other one, I think the accountability, I think it's a very, very important point that you make. Also recently I seen an evaluation by the evaluation unit of the National Parliament, the PVK, and they have analyzed the Gewässerschutzmaßnahmen of the cantons, and it's the Federal Office of Environment who is responsible to monitor the different measures by the cantons. And they also thought that basically there was the policy was not very effective, right? So one of the problem was that the BOF, so the Federal Office of Environment, they were not really keeping the cantons accountable because they didn't want to risk the good relationships they have with them. So, and I was also thinking about this missing accountability mechanism. So it fits very well, and I think there should be hopefully there is more research in this regard also in policy evaluation, because I think it's very relevant. But thanks a lot for the great talk.
Thank you so much. Should I respond immediately, or do we want to collect? So any other? I'm happy to respond. So.
I would respond because it was kind of complex already.
Yes,
so.
Thank you so much, Pirmin. And I mean, I really have to credit, because I wouldn't have written this chapter, but they basically gave us the impetus. They said, hey, why don't you write a chapter about this? And I was like, hey, that's a great idea. So, yes, I really like this idea to take this further to understand why evaluations might not be used at the street level. I think that's what you wanted to say. And that I don't really know, I cannot make a general statement about how powerful street level bureaucrats feel, because it depends on the policy and the context and so on. But we know that they feel more powerful if they are also involved in strategic decisions. And we know that this has a strongly motivating role on, and then we can ask whether this motivation translates into practice. It's a different question, but we know at the level of the motivation it really matters. And what I find really interesting is this recent work by Christoph Knill and his team about vertical policy integration. And they don't look at street-level bureaucrats at all. So they look at structures and how things are being done, and they look at whether there are mechanisms to involve policy implementers in policy making in different institutional contexts. And what they can show is that this systematically has a positive effect on policy performance, so on policy outcomes, outcomes. And so my hunch is that the psychological mechanism behind this is exactly what I've been talking about. This is really interesting work, and they have a really big data set. This is an ERC project from different countries, and they can really show that. Then, Yes, so your example about the cantonal, so that the policy was not effective because they didn't really want to hold the cantons accountable. I think that's really interesting because what you're basically saying is that we can also apply this relational perspective not to individuals but also to sort of institutional relations. And I think that is especially true in a federalist system like Switzerland, probably also in Germany. That would be like taking the agenda to the next level. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Please raise your hands. Yes, David.
Thank you, Eva, for your kind presentation. Very, very complete, I would say. I would have been interested in having your opinion about the potential impacts of political actors' attitudes and behaviors towards administrative actors in the shaping precisely or of street-level bureaucrats' behaviors and attitudes. I don't know if you already investigated this important topic.
That's a really, really great question.
And I have a second one. What would be your recommendations to mitigate these street-level bureaucrats' biases regarding public policies, outcomes, and outputs?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Two big questions and important ones. So, so the impact of political actors and structures on the attitudes of street-level bureaucrats. I haven't worked that much on it myself, but I think we've mentioned at least one of them already. So politicians can have an influence on that by involving street-level bureaucrats in decision-making. And a second one where, for example, Markus Hinterleitner, who is also here in Lausanne, is working on is this blame attribution. So what he has shown is that politicians have a tendency to shift blame to the bureaucracy. It's a convenient thing to do, and that this has a devastating psychological impact on street-level bureaucrats, and it can make their lives very difficult. And I think what the research that I presented shows is that politicians can, they can quite literally put street-level bureaucrats into dilemmas via the policies that they decide. But I mean, I'm not sure where to go with that or what to do with that. But that these would be at least three ways in which this would happen. And I think it would have to be thought through more systematically. And the second one, recommendations to mitigate the biases. So I think there is a lot of work to be done. So there is actually behavioral literature on de-biasing street-level bureaucrats. So you can show, for instance, that if you reduce their caseload, so if you reduce their workload, they take better decisions because they have more time for the decision to take a rational decision rather than using heuristics. I have also presented in my brief slide with the review, we've looked at basically the dependent variable of discrimination, so meaning applying some of the biases. And so we can start, so because the literature is getting bigger and bigger, so we can start evaluating the literature. And but I think the phenomenon of street-level bias it's so multifaceted, so it can take on so many forms that it's very hard to give a general answer to that. So I think you can assess the evidence in specific areas, so for specific behaviors. And I really want to stress again the point that I have made, that the use of heuristics by street-level bureaucrats as such is not necessarily something that we need to tackle. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It very often can be a good thing, leading to creativity, innovation, empathy, and lots of different things, to efficiency and so on. So I think the big work to be done is also, what are the aspects where we really and this is a political decision, I guess, in the end also, where we really don't want street-level bureaucrats to act in a biased way. So where do we set our priorities? Again, evaluators could do a job here. and then assess the evidence about it in this specific area. But the hunch is that the evidence is already there. There is such a rich literature. As soon as we overcome the disciplinary boundaries and understand like this behavioral field as being research from psychology and sociology and law and public health and political science and public admin, there is so much out there that we can look at. So the chance is that we can learn something from systematic reviews. So I know systematic reviews, they can be quite boring to read. and they are a lot of work, but they do this useful job of really sort of collecting the existing evidence out there and answering questions in this regard.
Merci pour tes questions, David. Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions? On accepte aussi des questions en français, si jamais. Hein.
Tu parles aussi le français. Si je te vois.
There in the back, please.
Yes, I would like to know if you addressed the aftermath of the divergence, maybe with bigger issues too. Could street-level bureaucrats keep on diverging, or maybe in the long term, will they comply with the policy, or would there be a turnover? Because it's like, it can be quite difficult to always like, yes, diverge with what you're supposed to do.
Yeah, that's a great question. We didn't really look at this time dimension. So we did do those interviews as well. So we did do the 35 qualitative interviews, and I do not remember from these interviews specifically statements that people would have basically changed their attitudes or their behaviors over time. But there also, the time dimension is not really big because the policy was introduced in 2015 and the interviews were done in 2020. So we maybe didn't have the time yet to look at that. And I mean, we also have to understand that this UK prevent duty is a really extreme case in a lot of ways. It's extremely contested, extremely ambiguous. And there is really, it's very difficult to follow up on the street-level bureaucrats. So basically first to detect whether they diverge and then second to sort of do something about it. And so I would say it is an unlikely case for this kind of process to happen. But I could well imagine that in other policies where this accountability, managerial or maybe even political accountability on the street-level bureaucrats is stronger, that you could achieve this kind of learning effect. And what our results suggest is that training really helps there. So the better trained, so the more they understand the policy, the more willing they are also to implement it, even if they don't think it's a good policy.
Thank you. Yes, I see another hand up. Here in the front, Audrey.
Je vais poser la première question en français, comme je viens de l'État de Vaud. Donc, tout d'abord, merci beaucoup, Eva, pour ta présentation qui était extrêmement riche et très complète. Ça m'a fait une excellente, je ne veux pas dire révision, mais aussi j'ai appris énormément de choses sur le développement du champ sur la street-level bureaucracy ces dernières années. Moi, j'avais 2 points, 2 remarques. La première, c'est qu'en se focalisant avec une approche comportementale sur les attitudes ou les comportements des street-level bureaucrats à un niveau individuel, dans quelle mesure on arrive aussi, parce qu'à mon avis c'est très important, à intégrer aussi la perspective des street-level bureaucrat managers. Ça, je pense que c'est très très important. Souvent, on fait des études portant sur le niveau vraiment des gens qui sont en interaction directe avec les bénéficiaires. Mais il y a un acteur qui est très important entre la vision politique qu'a rappelé David Jock, les acteurs politiques, et les gens aux premières lignes, c'est les chefs de service, c'est les middle range managers, c'est tous ceux qui ils ont du pouvoir, ils ont une capacité décisionnelle sur notamment la question de l'équilibrage ou le déséquilibrage dans le public service gap. Et je pense que c'est très important aussi de pouvoir recueillir aussi leurs attitudes et leurs comportements, parce qu'ils ont de la marge de manœuvre décisionnaire, ils ont de l'influence sur le processus, notamment d'allocation de ressources. Et ça, je pense que c'est très important. Comment on intègre les managers, ça c'est le premier élément. Puis le deuxième élément, est-ce que tu pourrais peut-être donner quelques exemples de recherche ou d'évaluation de politique publique où, à ton sens, et par rapport aux critères que tu as mis en avant, tu les montrerais comme des recherches exemplaires sur comment, précisément, intégrer la variable street level, on va dire, dans un bon design d'évaluation d'une politique publique. Si tu avais quelques exemples empiriques, ce serait formidable. Mais je te remercie beaucoup pour cette présentation qui était passionnante.
Merci à
et qui
toi.
nourrit la réflexion. Merci.
Je vais essayer de répondre en français, mais je ne sais pas si je suis capable. Donc, ta première question sur les street level managers, je suis absolument d'accord. Et pour moi, si je dis street level bureaucracy, je les inclus toujours. Et je crois que comme chercheurs de street level bureaucracy, nous devons aussi inclure toujours les managers. Et Anna Koffen, elle fait ça. Je ne sais pas combien d'autres le font systématiquement. Je crois que c'est encore un peu... On ne le fait pas assez souvent. Il faut le faire plus fréquemment. Comment peut-on faire ça? Je crois que, et spécialement pour les évaluateurs des politiques publiques, ce serait un pas routinier, on dirait ça? Routine step? Oui? Oui. De faire ça, de parler avec eux. Ils ont un rôle très important parce que ils sont les intermédiaires entre les ressources et aussi les politiques, tout ça, et les street level bureaucrats. Voilà. Et ils ont... leur rôle est aussi de... Okay, I need to switch to English, sorry. So by means of their... So they're basically like to filter between the outside and the inside, right? And so they have a really important role, for example, in motivating street level bureaucrats, in sort of, protecting them from some of the external pressures. And I mean, we all know that they do that routinely. And I mean, if you look at, for example, at the pandemic, how my husband did research about the leaders of the daycare facilities, who basically had to sort of find a way to comply with those sometimes really nonsensical rules that just simply cannot be applied to small children, and making sure that their caregivers can do their job. And so they were under extreme strain, so they're often under actually more extreme pressure than student workers. So just to reiterate that this should be done and should probably be a routine step for policy evaluators to do. And I think they can basically collect the voices of their employees and then bring them to the political level. And we also know that they do that. So the research by Anna Koffen shows that they routinely do that and they act as policy entrepreneurs. So the street level managers try to advocate for policy change when they can. Your second question, comment intégrer exemple? So I have to admit that my past in policy evaluation, it's a while ago. And I haven't recently read applied evaluation reports. But my co-author, Eva Liebeherr, is still very active here in Switzerland in policy evaluation. So I think she would be much better suited to answer this question. But we are using some of the examples of her work. I think she evaluated a forest integration policy here in Switzerland, and they looked at the attitudes of those forest. I don't know the word in English. Well, so yeah, I would point you to her work, and kindly openly admit that I don't know a very concrete example right now because I'm just a little bit out of the evaluation business by now. So, unfortunately, and due to my international career, which in the UK, it's impossible to do policy evaluation when you work at the university, basically. There are strong disincentives, so I would have had to do it in my free time, because if I would do it during my work, I would have to give like 80% of the money to the university. So I couldn't like hire anyone or, I couldn't do anything.
Thank you very much. Merci pour vos questions. There's someone else.
Merci pour la conférence. J'ai une petite question entre les street-level bureaucrats et leur interaction avec leurs collègues hors de leur domaine. C'est-à-dire quand un employé, un professeur se retrouve dans une autre administration, comment est-ce qu'ils interviennent ou est-ce qu'ils se comprennent mieux, sachant que chacun a un cadre, un référentiel plus précis qu'un simple citoyen qui n'a rien à faire avec l'administration.
Mm-hmm. So, yes, that's a good question. So I think that, in principle, so the accountability regimes framework focuses on the social relationships of street-level bureaucrats that they find meaningful. Because if they find this social relationship meaningful, then they will behave accordingly. So they will want to try and please this audience. That's the mechanism behind it. That's why it influences what they do. So if some of those relationships with people outside of their profession, for instance, is basically a relationship that systematically occurs in their professional everyday life, and if it's something that some of them strongly refer to, so it is meaningful to them, then I would include it as an accountability regime. So theoretically, there is no limit to the accountability regimes that street-level bureaucrats can be exposed to. So I've mentioned 5 of them, I think, but there can be others. It would really depend on the concrete setting. And if these relations are basically fulfill this definition of an accountability regime, then I would expect that, yes, it would shape their attitudes toward the policy. Does that answer your question?
Merci beaucoup pour votre présentation qui me parle beaucoup pour avoir utilisé ce cadre théorique il y a un certain temps et puis pour travailler dans le domaine de l'évaluation actuellement. J'aurais une question puis une remarque qui est un peu une réponse à la question d'Aurélien Buffa. La première, sur la remarque, c'est est-ce qu'en mettant la focale sur les mécanismes psychologiques des street-level bureaucrates, on ne risque pas de renforcer encore les dilemmes qu'ils subissent? Parce qu'en fait, leurs responsables, on se dit « Oh, mais c'est pas possible, ils font vraiment pas les trucs, ils comprennent rien du tout. » Et en rajoutant des couches de redevabilité, d'accountability supplémentaires par-dessus et en rendant encore la mise en œuvre plus compliquée. Est-ce que les problèmes, c'est pas plutôt la charge de travail trop importante, vous l'avez dit un petit peu, et puis des politiques mal conçues, et que c'est là-dessus qu'il faudrait mettre l'accent plutôt que sur le comportement des personnes qui sont chargées de mettre en œuvre ces politiques mal fichues dans un cadre qui est mal fichu. Ça, c'est ma question. Et ma remarque, c'est sur les évaluations qui intègrent les street-level bureaucrats. Et là, j'ai un exemple d'évaluation que j'ai conduite dans le domaine des bourses et prêts d'études à Genève. Et c'était vraiment très intéressant. En fait, on a construit un groupe de travail avec des gestionnaires de bourses. Parce qu'au départ, le responsable, le directeur général de cet office a dit « Ouais, c'est pas possible, il y a des gens qui n'appliquent pas les règles dans notre office. » Je me suis dit, ouais, ok, on va les prendre. On a discuté avec et ça a permis, d'une part, d'identifier les points sur lesquels la loi était mal fichue, effectivement, mais aussi de les rassurer, en fait, par rapport à leur conception, effectivement, leur préconception, leurs préjugés qu'elles avaient. C'était des gens qui étaient du domaine administratif. Et ils disaient, ouais, mais les étudiants, ils profitent à fond, alors que les gens qui ont fait des CFC, ils sont pénalisés. Puis leur faire comprendre qu'il y avait un mécanisme cognitif là-dessus. Et puis l'autre chose, c'était aussi, elle avait cité des cas particuliers. On a fait une analyse quantitative des demandes de bourse. On a dit, ouais, ce cas particulier pour lequel vous voulez changer la loi, en fait, ça représente 5 personnes par année. Et ça a beaucoup calmé, en fait, les tensions qu'il y avait dans la mise en œuvre au sein du service. J'ai aussi assisté à des réunions à l'intérieur du service, en fait, entre la direction et puis les collaborateurs, et surtout les collaboratrices, il y en avait beaucoup. Et Il y avait vraiment énormément de tensions, de gens qui n'étaient pas d'accord sur les règles à mettre en œuvre. Et le fait d'avoir pu se dire, mais en fait, ce problème-là, il n'est pas significatif, celui-là non plus, ça avait beaucoup conduit à rendre la mise en œuvre de la politique plus simple, sans tout refaire non plus, parce qu'il n'y avait pas une mise en œuvre adéquate.
Well, thank you so much for this fascinating example. So I would love to read that. Yeah, I think you're asking a really important question, and I probably haven't been clear enough about that. I've tried, but I want to stress again. So I would not. The purpose of all of this that I've said is not to sort of put the blame on bureaucrats or put pressure on them to change their behaviors. The message that I've tried to send is that we can learn from talking to them and studying their behaviors about the design of the policy and about how their workload is related to the performance of the policy, right? And so the implications for policy evaluation are not in the end, you have to de-bias the bureaucrats. Again, so that I think that there can be situations where it is warranted to do that, but most of the time, the potential that I see here is to get a better understanding of how the policy design could be improved so that it works better in practice, or how a policy is, and how a policy might be based on flawed causal hypothesis or flawed intervention hypothesis, for instance. So that would be, I think, that's where I see the potential. And you're right that this is a danger of, putting the spotlight on them, that it would end up that way, and it shouldn't.
Researchers understand.
Yes.
But decisioners don't really always understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. So it's a problem of communicating it.
We have time for a few more questions, maybe 2 or 3 maximum. I don't see any hands up, so I'm using that opportunity to ask my own question, if I may. So we've heard today multiple times, both from you and I think from the audience as well, that it would be good to think more systematically as decision makers, as policy makers, about the behavior of street-level bureaucrats. But we've also heard that in Switzerland so far, neither at the federal level nor at the cantonal level nor anywhere else, that's really done anywhere, I think. Are you aware of any other regions, countries in the world where that's already being done? Is that the case in Israel with Anat Gofen's research? Is that also related to more awareness in practice in Israel, or is that just on the research side? Do you know anything about that?
Good question. I actually don't know if that's not being done in Switzerland, so there may well be examples of that. I don't know. But if nobody here in the room knows an example, then that's maybe an indicator that it's not being done.
Systematically, I don't think, right?
I think I would have to look more at this work that I mentioned on the vertical policy integration. Maybe they have a case that rates high on this. But I know that it's being done a bit more, I think, in the Netherlands. That's basically the one example that comes to my mind, where there are just so many scholars working on this, and they are working quite closely with the public administration that I think, they're a bit further.
Unsurprising, given the amount of research that comes out of the Netherlands sometimes on this. So would probably be good to also look at what practitioners in the Netherlands do to maybe learn from them as well. Since we in Switzerland, we often have a bit of a closed-in perspective on Switzerland sometimes and only look at maybe what the other cantons are doing, but we rarely ever look outside of Switzerland what's going on in practice sometimes, I have a feeling. Thank you. Another chance for the audience to ask your questions to Eva while she's with us. She's looking forward to the apéro, I can tell you, so use the opportunity.
You can also ask me at the apéro.
That's true. Yes, Pascal.
I have one general question. Oh, first of all, thanks for your presentation. It was really interesting and very inspiring for me. I have one general question about street-level bureaucrats, because in the end, it's a lot of people. You were talking about nurses, police officers, but then also the people who work in administrations that give out IDs, that treat like unemployment demands. So people with lots of different backgrounds as well, that studied medicine, biology, teachers that maybe studied mathematics or something. So some of them might have ended up in the public sector or serving the public maybe more randomly, because actually they studied biology and are really interested in the topic, but then they end up being a teacher. So I was wondering in how far what your background is and how you were trained during your studies has an effect, because, for example, people who study at the IDHEAP, the Master of Public Administration, they learn all these things, so they are really like aware, or maybe also of the biases and heuristics and stuff. But other people who come from completely different disciplines, they are completely from another world. So, but they are all called street-level bureaucrats. So I was wondering about that.
Yes, no, I mean, you're absolutely right to point this out. And there are people who actually prefer the term professionals over street-level bureaucrats, so emphasizing the role of the specific profession. But I think it's a general feature of the street-level bureaucracy literature to understand street-level bureaucrats as, amongst other things, as I've shown, professionals. And that, of course, implies exactly what you said, so that the training that they've received and the professional socialization that they have received is a key factor shaping how they think about policies, how they act, and so on. And so what you're saying, yeah, is it conceptual stretching? I think that's what you're asking. I think it always depends. It depends on what you want to compare. So I think what it tells us is that if we want to understand what street-level bureaucrats do, we need to understand their professional background, their professional values and norms and practices. And if we don't include that in our assessment, then we're probably engaging in conceptual stretching when comparing different professions.
Last chance for you to ask a question before the apéro. There doesn't seem to be any more questions, Eva. So thank you very, very much for, first of all, reminding us again that many of us are street-level bureaucrats. We tend to forget sometimes. And mostly, thank you so much for coming for this very interesting talk today. Thank you so much for traveling to Lausanne and back to Constance in just one day. Thanks so much for coming, and looking forward to discussing at the apéro. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And for the great questions.
And of course, some Swiss chocolate to take home to Germany, where you don't get such good chocolate.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for participating and your interesting questions. Thank you.